The third question is from Professor Cesar Landa, who is a former president of the Peruvian Constitutional Court, the Tribunal Constitucional. Former.
I actually read opinions.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Former Vice
Bueno,
Minister.
leer español, para hablar es un problema.
He is also former Vice Minister of Justice, former Dean of Catholic Law School,
Right.
former Judge ad hoc of the International Court of Human Rights. So the question is the following. Following all the legal measures against the scientific fight against the pandemic, the withdrawal of international commitments to fight global warming, the support to white supremacism, and not condemn police violence against Black citizens, would you rate the Trump administration as an example of an illiberal democracy?
Yes. Yes. I mean, and that's why it was so important. This election was, the turnout of this election was expanded by 20 million votes. Actually, many sober people, rather than expected that the turnout would be much lower, because everyone is, people are dying. Everyone knows somebody who's has a real problem. There are, in the United States today, tens of millions of people who are suddenly out of work. The amount of violence at home, with husbands beating up their wives in frustration. Not in, I'm not trying to excuse it, but it's way up. Suicides are way up. Many people, including myself, expected this turnout to go down. That would be logical, people are, and the mail-in ballots are unfamiliar to most Americans. They're not used to doing it. And they had to apply for them and all this. This is all new procedures. Nevertheless, 20 million more Americans came out, and both sides, because they knew that this was the turning point of American democracy. Not the first one, but the most fundamental turning point since Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Revolution, when once again, millions of people on both sides, there's something called the Ku Klux Klan and the White Citizens Council. There were tens of millions of committed racists, burning people up. And there were tens of millions, I was one of them actually, marching in the streets in support. And then we won the election with a tremendous turnout, and that's what led to the enactment of the great statutes, the Civil Rights Act of '64, the Voting Rights Act of '65, which empowered Black people to vote, and further ones. But that was a turning point. If the racists had won then, this would have been a devastating blow. And if you look back in 1968, you can see that there was a worldwide revolution. This is happening in France. This is happening in Germany. In fact, in that time, the Americans succeeded more than the French and the Germans, which is, but at this time, people turned out because they knew that if they voted for Trump a second term, this would be the end of American democratic experience. The end, because it's one thing for Trump to have done all these terrible things in the first term, but he would then say he has a mandate in the second term to even do much worse things and in a much more serious way. And at a time of environmental crisis, he would have done nothing. And also, and even more seriously, the environmental crisis is 30, 40 years from now. We might, unless we do dramatic things, make this planet uninhabitable for the next generation and the generation after that. But the short-term crisis, of course, is nuclear annihilation. And President Trump is utterly irresponsible. Again, acts regularly against fundamental principles of international law. His decision to invade Iran and kill the number 2 leader the number 2 leader of this number 3 leader of the government, the Ayatollah, then we had the president, and then him. This was a dramatic provocation, which could easily generate in the second term of Trump nuclear response. And his emphatic interventions in the Gulf of Taiwan, in the Straits of Taiwan, I'm sorry, is even more dangerous. That could easily provoke, especially with this person who switches his agenda every day, a nuclear confrontation with China, which would destroy the world. It was, and everybody realized that, and we came out and they voted no by huge numbers. It's true, of course, that Trump's people came out too, but there weren't enough of them. There were 5 million more Americans who voted no than, and they voted no on behalf of Joe Biden, who was, to put it mildly, not a charismatic leader. But that wasn't important. They were voting no to Trump. Let's have some sensible person. And Trump and Biden, whatever else you can say, is deeply committed to democracy. And a first priority of his, I mean, I know this, is to reconstruct the democratic alliance between Europe and the United States. And a second one is to reaffirm and reconstruct the Organization of American States and the complicated system of fundamental rights protection, which Trump just destroyed, and encouraging the disintegration of the OAS. We have a lot to do in reconstruction, but at least this is a central priority of Biden. And I have every reason to think that this will happen. Whether it will be successful, whether it will be creative enough, will it be imaginative enough? Well, that's for the Latin Americans to come right in there and try to actually, be collaborators.
Thank you. I cannot agree more with your analysis. Now the fourth question is from Professor Jorge León, who is also professor of Con Law at the Catholic Law School and former Vice Minister of Justice, and also former jurisdictional assessor of the Constitutional Court. His question is the following: how much pluralism and tolerance can a democracy bear, especially in times when fundamentalist and extremist positions appeal to the same freedoms of those who reject said positions? That's the question.
This is a profound question. And I hate to be coming back to the parliamentarianism, presidentialism choice, you see, but one of the great advantages of parliamentarianism in Peru is that the representatives of the shining path will sit in parliament. Representatives of Fujimori will sit in parliament in significant numbers, 10, 15, 20, 25, but they won't govern. But they will sit, and that will indicate that they aren't merely alien enemies of democracy. And who knows? It might be, I mean, it's, much, I mean, we're talking, when we talk about a new constitution, we're talking about a structure for a framework for the next 40 years. The American experience of having an old constitution of the 18th century still there, this is an anomaly. Modern constitutions are post-war constitutions throughout the world. But we are now in the 21st century. And the key here is that if we look 10 years ahead of time, well, maybe, who knows what the shining path is going to look like so far as armed rebellion and drug trades and all that is concerned. But the next generation of people from the left may develop a more democratic notion of democratic socialism. And who knows, the successors, of Fujimori isn't going to be there forever. And even she will have to propitiate the members of the quote unquote popular force who are more centrist, because they may desert her and go into the next political party, which goes to a final point, which I do think is worth mentioning. Peru doesn't have, has too many parties, political parties. And this is terrible. We need a certain small number of political parties so that ordinary people could say, aha, this one is the centrist party. This one is the left of center party. The way to accomplish that is through, it's a risky way, nothing is not risky, is through threshold requirements. If your political party does not get 7.5% of the vote, you get no representation in parliament. This creates an incentive for, you have so many political parties that you have one person from each political party, et cetera, and so forth. This creates an incentive for them to say, well, we're all pretty much the same. And isn't it better to be in the government, in parliament, then we'll be members of the government, and then then the question will be, well, will it be you or me or maybe both of us who will become ministers? So this creates, and this is the science of this is constitutionalism as a real integration of political science, law, and historical understanding. You have to actually think in a very systematic way about incentives. Anyway, I did think it was important because this is a pathology of the Peruvian system, which is not shared in many other countries, which do have larger, in Latin America, larger parties than in Peru. I mean, if you look at Brazil, or Argentina, or there are substantial, serious parties of the left, center left, and center, et cetera, and so forth. But that's not true in Peru, and that's an anomaly which is not to Peru's advantage.
Right. Thank you, Professor Ackerman, and thank you for analysis. It invites us to reflection. We have 3 questions left, and So the next question is, what should be the limits on Peruvian presidents to dissolve Congress and call a new election? Are the current limits appropriate or inappropriate? And how should they be modified? That's
excellent. Because you see, there are two kinds of presidentialism in the world today. One is Gaullist French style of presidentialism, which has actually been the model for many, many countries, including Peru. I call this is generally understood to be a weaker form of presidentialism than the American kind, but this is simply an analytic mistake. I call what you have in France or in Peru super presidentialism. Why? Because in one variation or another, the president, let's just take the actual French model. Macron is in a position to, at the end of 1 year, dissolve parliament and call a new election. So this means that the present members of parliament are very scared. If they vote of no confidence, or they don't do what he's telling them to do, they have to run again, and maybe they'll lose. So they had a great job, now they lost it. In the United States, the crucial difference is that the president cannot dissolve Congress. The House of Representatives has a fixed 2-year term. The Senate has a fixed, each senator has a fixed 6-year term, and only 1/3 of the Senate is renewed every 2 years. The president has a 4-year term. That means that he is much weaker. If Nancy Pelosi were the prime minister of France under Biden, and Biden didn't like what she was doing, he would say, "You're out." And everybody would say, "Yes, you're right. I mean, let's." There's only been one occasion. So that means that the American system has this fundamental check on presidential power. To put it, we saw it in a different form before, that it's only if the president manages to win a tremendous mandate that carries all 3 political bodies, President, House, and Senate, at the same time, that he can really act decisively. While in Peru, in the standard case, forget about this terrible thing, the president can really basically do what he wants to do. And Parliament can't stop him, because if it did, it'll get dissolved. Sure, the president is going to say, vote. Let's hear 2 votes of no confidence in 30 days. Do it. Fine. Oh. So this means, you see, that you have a super presidential system, and if, as a result of this 2-stage process, extreme right-winger who has 25% of the real strong support of the population manages to become president, he or she can be a dictator. Right. Much more easily than in the American case. And we see that, by 5 minutes, this is after after all, I'm not proud of what happened in the United States. But that is to say, I would have hoped for a much stronger repudiation of Trump than actually occurred. And I would have preferred it if Biden had much stronger majorities in both houses, and he probably won't have a majority in the Senate. And he has a narrow majority in the House. But nonetheless, this fundamental check that the president cannot dissolve Congress is the feature that saved American democracy.
Right.
Not the Supreme Court, but it's that feature. And so that's in some way a response, I think, to this a question of should if you adopt presidentialism in the next Constituent Assembly, I would very much strongly recommend the elimination of the power of the president to dissolve Congress. Impasse is better than dictatorship.
Absolutely. Thank you. I really hope that Peruvian politicians and common law professors will listen to this answer and will watch this video. Sixth question is only two last questions. This question is from Professor Walter Arban, who is a former Peruvian ombudsman, former Minister of the Interior, former Dean of Catholic Law School, etc., etc. So the question is the following. If the purpose is to enable adequate citizen representation in Congress, what criteria should be adopted to establish an optimal ratio between the number of voters and that of congressmen?
Well, I do think that that 130 members of the Assembly is too small. But so that it would be better. But these are important questions of institutional design. But this is just the kind of thing that the Constituent Assembly should be concerned with. So I would definitely suggest something like 300 or 350 representatives, but so long as we reform the party system as well, so that we don't have 350 little political parties. As I said, Peru is the leader in the world in the construction of teeny political parties. And that would lead to organizational chaos in this 350 member assembly. But I do think that especially since Peru has become a much more pluralist society with many more expressions of difference that are legitimate. It used to be, after all, that there was a group, I would call them, I don't know whether they called themselves that in Brazil, the Peninsulares. They were the elite who came from nowhere and spoke maybe even with a Castilian accent. And everybody else was, barbarian to one or another degree. But this is no longer true in Peru. It is, of course, true. There's an elite, and there's an economic elite, and there's a very bad distribution of wealth. It's almost as bad as in the United States. But nonetheless, even the top people and the uppermost classes don't think of themselves in the same manner as the same elite did in 1900.
Right.
And that's great. What we're actually seeing is the cultural development of foundations of democratic life, both pluralism, different regions of the country, higher education levels. This means that Peru is capable of a more vibrant democracy than any time in its history. The question, of course, is really the challenge of institutional design. How can we learn from these different countries? And this is why, of course, my last book is the first of a series on comparative constitutional development. I've done a good deal of work on this earlier, but I was spending a great deal more of my time on America, enough of America, and over the last really quite a number of years, I've been exploring in one way or another the constitutional developments in different parts of the world. And comparative work is, okay, let's talk about Latin American, South American constitutionalism, regional, or Asian constitutionalism. No, that's good, all that's good, but I want to say, you know, maybe Peru can learn something from South Africa. Maybe South Africa could learn something from France. Maybe, you know, et cetera, and so forth. Because after all, whatever I think, there'll be many presidentialist systems in the 20th century. While I believe or hope that Peru is open to a fundamental rethinking, the United States is not. If I were to say seriously to my fellow Americans, let's have a parliamentary system, they would say, Bruce, you have gone off the wall. You are nuts. We always thought you were, but we never really thought you were because you actually had something to say about our system, but now you're simply been taken over by a gremlins. But in South America, the question is, you know, it's perfectly understandable why South Americans looked to the United States in the 19th and early 20th centuries, because it was the only functioning democracy in the world, protected by 3,000 miles from the Germans and the other empires. But now we have many countries, despite all this total crisis, that have had rich democratic experiences for 70 years. And that's what we should be looking at, not what happened in Peru in 1880.
So Professor Ackerman, the last question, and the seventh question, and I want you to know that the seventh question, this question is probably the most controversial one in Peru, is the one everyone is waiting to hear. This question is from Professor Pedro Grandes, who is also professor of Con Law at Catholic University and San Marcos University, as well as the director of the LLM program specialized in constitutional law of San Marcos University. So his questions are the following. Well, I know you have read the economic chapter of the Peruvian Constitution.
Sure.
So do you think that it should also be reformed? And in that regard, Professor Grandes also asks, what elements can be taken into account to move towards a constituent process? And what is the role of social movements in constitutional changes? What level of social integration can be expected from a constituent process? Those are the questions.
Well, they're actually related to one another. The social movement that we see in Peru is already enough to have delegitimated Congress. Just, you know, if the Peruvians had just said, "Ah, well, yes, that's all right. It's just these arrogant people in." Who are imposing their will on us, and we will passively accept it, well then, we would have a new president of Brazil, new president of Peru, sitting there without, he wouldn't have resigned in 6 days. So we have a mobilized social movement, just as they had in Eastern Europe. There were mobilized social movements to repudiate the communist dictatorial regime. One of the crucial points of my investigations in Eastern Europe, which I emphasize in my most recent book, is that is the revolutionary constitutions in comparative perspective book, is that the energy of these movements was diverted from creating a new constitutional framework for democracy to economic policy, so that the central leadership did not focus on this fundamental problem of constitutional legitimacy and trying to gain the self-conscious consent of the Peruvian people in a referendum for the constitutional constituent assembly. Then the constituent assembly then goes and, all these people who are elected, their future political reputations are on the line. If they don't put together a constitutional framework that a majority of their fellow Peruvians will say yes to, they have been discredited for life. So it's in their interest not to quibble with one another, but to actually put together a framework that their fellow Peruvians could believe in. We see in Poland, we see in many places in Eastern Europe that instead of devoting their energy to this as the first priority, they devoted it to trying to talk about the relationship between free markets and state ownership. And I call this the race against time, the race to create a constructive constitutional framework that their fellow citizens could believe in and affirm and start working within and say that it's ours after this terrible period of communist dictatorship was lost. So while the economic issues are important, they should not divert attention from the constitutional question. Are you prepared for another 25 years of crises like the ones that you've had in the past 25 years? Because you have a unique opportunity to try, you have the movement, you have a unique opportunity to put together something that is actually credible to Peruvians who have lost faith in their democracy. Once we have an ongoing system, then this issue of to what extent should what should the relationship between state ownership and private ownership be? The answer is it's a hard question. There are a lot of reasonable answers to that. It depends on the particular situation of the oil market. It depends on the particular, there are a lot of things that it depends on, and there's no final answer to that. What we want is sensible problem solving. Maybe the right answer is to sell off all state ownership right now, and 10 years from now, maybe the right answer is have state ownership again. That's what they're arguing about in Mexico right now. There's no simple answer. It does matter, however, whether López Obrador actually generates confidence in the Mexican people that they have a new beginning in democratic life. I don't know whether that's the question he's raising. That's the question that, in a very different way, Biden is raising. And that's the question you should be raising.
Well, thanks so much, Professor Ackerman, for your time and your enlightening answers. Hopefully the pandemic will end soon, and next time we can invite you to come to Peru.